I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Linda's here. Linda asked a question, but she's not here, so I won't answer. So we'll just return to the text, and we're on page, for those who are following in the copy, or want to follow on, and we're on page 280. So we're in a section, the heading here is divisions of conventionalities, right? So if you remember, right, we're in a section where Lama Tsongkhapa is talking about differentiating conventional truths, right, and ultimate truths. Conventional truth and ultimate truth, or conventionalities and ultimate truth. And so he's kind of given different definitions. He's defined what is conventional truth, and we talked about that. So now he's going to talk about different divisions of conventional truth. And he starts this section by making an interesting point. Obviously, you guys get this sense. This section is very technical, so that's a technical, but interesting point, where he's differentiating. Because we're looking at this from a Madhyamaka perspective, right? But now he's going to make a distinction between Svatantrika Madhyamakas, right, which are sometimes in English, what do we say, like Madhyamaka is middle way, right? But Svatantrika means like that they use syllogisms or proofs of emptiness, that they call it autonomous. Like, in other words, where both parties have to agree on the premise. Whereas Prasangika Madhyamakas are different, right? They mainly rely, they can also do that, they both do both, but Prasangika Madhyamakas, the word Prasangika means consequential, right? So usually Prasangika Madhyamakas prove emptiness by pointing out the absurd consequences of their opponent's position, right? So he's differentiating a little bit between these two schools of Madhyamaka thought in terms of how they divide or discuss conventional truth. And so he makes this point that he says, Svatantrika Madhyamakas ascertain that consciousness, which appears to be established by way of its own character, exists just as it appears, right? So what he's pointing out there is that for Svatantrika Madhyamakas, the subjective mind, right, the perceiving mind, seems to exist by way of its own character and does actually exist that way. Obviously for Prasangikas that's not the case. For Prasangikas, as we've been discussing, all conventional truth objects appear one way but don't exist in the way they appear. So it's a difference between those two sub-schools of Madhyamaka. So for them, right, he says, they do distinguish between real and wrong subjects. But they do not, rather, distinguish. Because for them, the subjective mind exists as it appears. But they do differentiate based on the objects of perception between real and they don't, in other words, for them, let me read it to say it clearly. Therefore, they do not distinguish between real and wrong subjects, meaning subjective minds, right? But instead distinguish whether the appearance of the objects do or do not exist by way of their own character in accordance with how they appear. And so what he's saying, well, I'll read the quote because it explains it more. Then he quotes this text. It says, they seem the same, but since some can and some cannot fulfill a function, a distinction is made between real and unreal conventionalities. So, for them, the objects perceived, and this is what this is how they distinguish real and unreal conventional truth objects. That a real conventional truth object for them can perform a function, right? Like a table can hold a cup, right? Or a cup can hold liquid. Whereas for them, unreal conventionalities are just appearances that can't perform a function. And they would give an example like the reflection of a face is not an actual face. It can't perform the function of a face. The reflection of a table can't perform the function of a table. Or a hallucination of a table can't hold objects. And so on. So that's the way they would differentiate real and unreal conventionalities. And actually, if you think about that for a moment, well, you know, their position is quite. I mean, you can see how it's quite reasonable, isn't it? In other words, like what they're saying is, you know, the perceiving mind perceiving something exists, right? Even if even if a perceiving mind is perceiving a hallucination, the mind exists that's perceiving it, right? So they would, you know, from their perspective, that makes some sense, doesn't it? That the consciousness in either case exists, right? But the object perceived sometimes is real, like a person or a table or a chair, and sometimes is unreal, right? Like a dream object, a hallucination, or reflection, and so on. Actually, if you know, so part of the point there is that the Svatantrika Madhyamaka school is quite a good philosophical school, right? It's not to put that school down. So I mean, you can see how that position makes quite a lot of sense. Then he says, this system, meaning the Prasangikas, asserts that whatever appears to the ignorant as established by way of its own character is an appearance of that consciousness polluted by ignorance. Therefore, conventional objects are not distinguished as the two, real and wrong. And so he's differentiating now. He's saying for Prasangikas, all objects, what's there you say, right? All objects are incorrect, right? Because they perceive things as truly existent even though they're not truly existent, or they perceive things as existing by way of their own character, but they don't exist that way, right? So they would say, you know, the consciousness, like a person who appears in a dream appears to exist by way of its own character, but doesn't. But also when you're awake and you meet somebody, they appear to exist by way of their own character, but don't. So both are in error, right? So the Prasangika perspective, you could say, is a more radical position. Is that a fair way to describe it? I think so. So actually we're going to get into this in a little while, right? But you can start to ask, well, but there's some difference between a dream person and a real person. And the Prasangika would say, yeah, we'll get it. But what is that difference? They would say it's not that there's no error. Does that make sense? So now, he says, although the reflection of a face is not a conventional truth in relation to a worldly person familiar with words, it is a conventional truth generally speaking. Again, it's getting quite technical here. So first he quotes Chandrakirti. Whatever is false, even conventionally, is not a conventional truth. So again, now he's starting to differentiate these things. So he says, for a worldly conventional consciousness of someone familiar with words, or philosophy, or just words, who can reason, something like a reflection of a face is not a true face. Hence, it is not conventionally true from that point of view. While this is so, it is still an object found by a consciousness seeing a deceptive object, a false object of knowledge, so it is a conventional truth. The consciousness, which is a reflection, appears is mistaken about its appearing object, and likewise the ignorant to whom something blue and the like appears to be established by its own character are mistaken about their appearing object. So what he's starting to get at here, because this could be a bit confusing if you just read it, right? What he's starting to get at is, for a Prasangika philosopher, right? On the one hand, like he's getting at, when somebody sees a reflection of a face in a mirror, right? You don't need to do any ultimate analysis, right? Just from a worldly perspective, people know that's not a real face, right? That's not a philosophical, you don't need a deep philosophical analysis to know that. So from a worldly, and so he's saying from a worldly perspective, he's saying where he says from that point of view, so he's saying even from the worldly person's point of view, which is not a philosophical point of view, they know that's not a real object, a real face. Right? And so they know it's, what's the word? It appears it appears like a face, but it's not a face, right? And they all know that. So he's saying you can differentiate that point just from a worldly perspective. Does that make sense? There's no ultimate philosophical contemplation required. And so he's saying, now this is interesting here, I just want to read this sentence again. While this is so, it is still an object found by a consciousness seeing a deceptive object, a false object of knowledge. So it is a conventional truth, right? So here what he's getting at is, it's a subtle distinction, right? The face that appears in the mirror, even from the worldly point of view, is not a face, right? So it's not a, even conventionally it's not a face. But it does have a conventional truth status as a reflection. Does that make sense? And so when he says it is a conventional truth, what he's saying is there is a kind of conventional reality to that as a reflection, but not as a face. Does that make sense? And then he's saying, but, let's see if I say this right. This is where he says, but it's like, I'll read the actual line because it's quite subtle what he's saying. The consciousness which is the reflection the consciousness to which the reflection appears is mistaken about its appearing object. And what he's saying is all perceptions are mistaken with regards to their appearing object, right? So this is where he's getting at that Prasangikas allow for a worldly distinction between, a false appearance that everybody recognizes as false, which is like a mirage or a reflection, from a worldly perspective, and then things that actually exist as, from a worldly perspective, like a person or a real face. But from a Prasangika perspective, both are mistaken. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So that's a difference, right? And that's the radical stance that Prasangikas take. But it's subtle, right? They do allow for a distinction between a reflection of a face and a face, but they say that distinction is made based on worldly conventional discussion, not based on the ultimate status of those things, and not based on whether or not they're deceptive, because they're both deceptive. That's quite interesting, isn't it? Do you have a question?
I'm just trying to think that through. It's still deceptive, not because we believe it's a real person. We know it's a reflection.
Actually, part of what's deceptive about the reflection, right, is that, it's actually quite, Lama Tsongkhapa addressed this earlier in the text, actually, right? Whereas if you ask a worldly person who sees, actually, if you ask a little kid, they don't know sometimes, right? Babies sometimes won't know that. But if you ask a normal worldly person, is that a face? They'll say, no, that's my reflection, right? But then the reflection itself appears to be truly existent. Okay. That's the issue. Does that make sense? And so there's still an element that, in other words, they're still misperceiving that. They feel that it's a truly existent reflection, and that there's a truly existent perceiver of the reflection. And that's the mistaken part of that perception. Does that make some sense? Actually, I'm just going to pause for a second and use the restroom. I'll be right back. Sorry about that. Oh. for a second. Okay. So the next section, it starts with the heading. Although that mistaken consciousness does not posit a true object of comprehension, it helps posit a false object of comprehension. So he says, when a true object of comprehension is posited, it will be contradictory for a consciousness mistaken in that way to posit it. However, precisely that is helpful for positing false objects of comprehension, or deceptive objects, you could say, about comprehension. Otherwise, something could not be posited as a conventional truth if it had not been established conventionally. So when illusion-like falsities are posited conventionally, they could not be posited as conventional truths. Mike, do you want to explain that?
I know, I read that like 12 times last night.
I want to point out there's a couple of things. One is, what he's getting at is kind of what I already just said, actually. What he's getting at here is this, really, is that a true object of comprehension is positive. It would be contradictory for a conscious mistaken that way to posit it, right? However, precisely that is helpful for. So what he's getting at here really is that, like, an illusion exists as an illusion. A dream exists as a dream. Conventionally, right? Does a dream object, it's a very subtle distinction, isn't it? Does a dream object exist conventionally? No. Right, like in other words, if I say I dreamt of Paul I didn't. If I said I dreamt of Paul last night and we drove to California together or something. Like, in other words, from a conventional perspective, did Paul and I drive to California together last night? No, right? Because, but the dream of Paul exists as a dream, right? Conventionally. And does either, like, does Paul, so in other words, so one point he's getting at here is, like, so the dream of Paul exists as a dream, right? Does it ultimately exist? No. Does Paul ultimately exist? No. Is what he's saying. So what he's getting at. So, but here, this particular paragraph, what he's saying is the fact that a thing can appear in a false way allows for it to exist conventionally as a false thing, in the sense of like a dream or reflection, an illusion, right? Like you could say, if a person has a hallucination, does the object of the hallucination exist conventionally?
Yeah.
No.
Oh, right.
Right? In other words, the object of their hallucination doesn't, because somebody else can look in that same place and say, no, there's no dragon there, or whatever it is. Right? But conventionally, we can speak, like you can say, oh, this person needs help, they're having hallucinations. And that's a correct conventional statement, right? We would know what that means, and that would be a valid cognition, right? If somebody said, like, if a person says, wow, like, I had a hallucination, I need help, right? Did the object of hallucination exist conventionally? No. If they're talking about their hallucination, though, does that phenomena exist? Hallucinations? Yes. Right? And again, though, yeah, so anyway, that's all he's saying in this particular paragraph. Really.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I don't see the difference between those two statements.
Which
if I have that you just uttered, you just said, if I have an image in my head, picture, it's prasangika or considered permanent. Now, what is the difference between that and what he's talking about here? Even the image in my head is conventionally existing, right?
as an image in your head, yeah.
Yes, yes.
But not the object of the image, I think that's what it's saying.
Ah,
Conventional.
the object of the image, okay. Got
So,
it.
Dr.
That's it,
Warren,
thank you.
so can you explain again the deceptive object? I was confused. How does,
So a deceptive object, I guess part of what's subtle here is that he's getting at two different types of deceptive objects, right? So, which line actually? Let me make sure I can say which one he's
The
getting.
one below before that.
Like, so in the last paragraph or the one
Well,
before
this
it?
is so it is still the object found by a consciousness seeing a deceptive object. And can you relate that to your last example?
The second one
Are
is
both
paragraph.
I'm just not seeing.
scenarios?
Oh, you're talking about the paragraph
Yeah.
above. Okay.
Are both scenarios deceptive from a prasangika? Are they I'm so confused, sorry. Are they analyzing from a conventional perspective that both examples that you just gave, the person hallucinating and the person understanding that that's a hallucination, I suppose, are both deceptive? Is that
Yeah. So there, what he's getting at is he's getting at two different things, right? So the line above that is saying even a worldly person knows that a reflection is not a face, right? Now the second sentence, the one you're referring to, is answering the question that Jody asked. So it's saying, while this is so, in other words, while while this is so means, while it's true that even a worldly person knows that's not a face, right? It's still an object found by a consciousness, so that means still somebody's perceiving something, right? In this case, a reflection. Seeing a deceptive object, a false object of knowledge. There, what he's getting at is that person who's a normal worldly person, is seeing the reflection as truly existent. So in other words, they know it's not a truly existent face, but they still think there's a real perceiver and a real reflection out there.
right, yes.
And that's the deceptive part that he's referring to here. Yeah.
And
Does
that's
that
the
make sense?
difference between Swatantriya and Prasangika. Swatantriya would say it exists, and Prasangika would say no.
Svatantrikas would say they would differentiate the object, right? The object, the Svatantrikas would say the object can't perform a function, so it's not conventionally existent, but the subject is truly exists as it appears, or exists as it appears. They actually wouldn't say true. They would say intrinsically exists. That's what they would say. It does intrinsically exist.
Well, they go that far.
Whereas for the Prasangika, they would say, no, it's an object that's, or the whole thing is appearing, how does he say it? Falsely, right? There's a false appearance of an inherently existent subject and a false appearance of a inherently existent object, and that's not, those are false.
In the sense that
They're not inherently existent.
that they're all due to dependent arising.
Yeah. So that's the difference, yeah. Okay. So now, this is going to go on for a few pages, but he's going to start differentiating a little bit about, from a Prasangika perspective, still one can talk about right and wrong conventionalities. So he talks about, and I won't read all this, but he talks about how the Prasangika perspective talks about how there are 6 types of consciousness. That just means eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And each of those types of consciousness has its object, right? Sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought. And so here he's making one point, which is now he's just now here he's not talking about ultimately. He's just talking from a worldly perspective. We all can recognize that sometimes a person's they call those their sense powers, right? 6 sense powers. Sometimes the sense power is afflicted by some kind of cause of error, like a disease. Right? And when one is afflicted by that, then there will be a mistaken appearance, right? Like, and they often give an example, like a person who has an, what do you call it, like cataracts, and something appears out there, and then, you know, they can recognize, other people can say, oh, no, it's not there, right? And then the person can turn their head and see that the object's moving, and then they can go get tests, and they find that it's like cataract, for example, right?
So we're talking about floaters, I think.
What's that? Yeah, floaters,
Yeah,
yeah, that kind of thing.
okay.
I mean, there are all kinds of things like that, though, right, that you could get at. And what they're just saying is, you know, if a person has jaundice, things appear yellow, and so on, right? And what they're saying is, you know, we can all recognize this is not about, so what he's getting at here is from a worldly perspective, one can understand that when a person's sense powers are somehow affected by a cause of error, then something will appear, but it won't. But it's not a conventionally existent object, like a yellow mountain, right? If a person has jaundice and they see a snow mountain is yellow, and they say, "Oh, I see a yellow mountain," there's not a yellow mountain there. Right? And conventionally, we can agree on that because the person, somebody else can go, "No, it's not yellow, it's white." And then the person gets surgery, and then they see, "Oh, it was white." That they can get cataract surgery, or not, in that case, jaundice. That wouldn't be surgery. They would get they got treatment for the jaundice, and they came back, and they would say, "Oh, wow, I was wrong. It was white all along." So the object perceived by a defective sense power doesn't exist conventionally, is what he's saying, right? Whereas if a person's sense powers are working properly, and they perceive something with their eyes, for example, then that exists. So he's saying that's one way we can develop from a purely worldly perspective, right and wrong conventionalities are distinguished. And then he makes this point, though, near the end, where he says, in our Madhyamaka system, the appearance of reflections and the like, and the appearances of blue and the like, to someone with ignorance, therefore do not differ with regard to whether or not he is mistaken in relation to the appearing object. So that is why real and wrong conventionalities are not distinguished. And then he quotes Chandrakirti's commentary to the Middle Way. That which the worldly realize, apprehended by means of the 6 non-defective senses, is true only from the worldly perspective. The rest is posited as wrong from that perspective. So what he's getting at here is, from a purely worldly perspective, one can distinguish, like, oh, this person has defective sense powers, it's not existent. This person has non-defective sense powers. It's a correct, people say, oh yeah, that's right, there's a white mountain there, something like that. But then he's saying, that's only from the perspective of the worldly consciousness. Does that make sense? From the perspective of a Madhyamaka philosopher, both the white mountain that appears to the person with non-defective senses and the yellow mountain that appears to the person with jaundice appear one way and don't exist in the way they appear. Right? So he's saying, almost like you could say, it's two different, really what he's getting at, I just want to pause and sort of say, I said this once before, but I think it's really important to understand this section, is what he's really getting at here, if you contemplate it a bit, is that there are 2 different levels of analysis, and we can't confuse them if we're going to understand Madhyamaka philosophy, Prasangika Madhyamaka philosophy. One level of analysis is what he's calling worldly. And that level of analysis, first of all, doesn't have to involve any logic sometimes, but it can involve a kind of conventional discussion, a worldly discussion, right? But what's important is that level of discussion has no consideration, never considers the ultimate status of a thing, right? And within that purview of that worldly consciousness, there are correct and incorrect perceptions. Right? And that's only, but that one has to completely, what's the word? If one wants to understand Madhyamaka philosophy, one can say, okay, and sometimes, he doesn't use this, he says here the world, but sometimes, what's like that, right? Only from a worldly perspective, or sometimes Chandrakirti will say, the world can discuss, the world can determine that. In other words, that has no purview from the ultimate, in reference to the ultimate. Right? From an ultimate perspective, all those things are false. Does that make sense? So we're really having to differentiate 2 different perspectives, and Lama Tsongkhapa has been doing that throughout this section, hasn't he? He repeatedly sort of talks about from the perspective of what kind of consciousness are we talking, right? So here he's saying, from just a worldly consciousness, right? That's valid, right? Like if your friend has jaundice and is seeing things as yellow, then you're going to have some, there's no question about ultimate analysis there, right? You're going to say, oh, I'm worried about you, and do you see this as yellow, and do you see that as yellow, oh, it's white, oh, this isn't really yellow, there's no discussion of ultimate status there, but one can distinguish on that level, right, between real and unreal appearances. And what he's saying is the unreal ones don't exist conventionally, right? The ones that are right in that sense exist conventionally. Then he's saying both right and wrong appearances, if you look from the ultimate, right now we're looking, if we switch and we look from the ultimate perspective, both right appearances and wrong appearances are wrong.
From the Prasangika standpoint, the Svatantrikas then, if it's a right conventional appearance, is different ultimately than if it's a wrong conventional appearance?
For them, right, for Svatantrikas, and I think there, just to clarify, I actually, he doesn't say this here, but I think he's talking about, there are two different subschools of Svatantrikas. There's the, so I think he's talking from the Yogatara Svatantrika Madhyamaka perspective, I think. But so I think what he's saying is from their perspective, the subjective side, right, like, exists as it appears. Whereas, that's the distinguishing point, right? Like, that it appears to exist intrinsically and it does exist intrinsically. Or it appears to exist from its own side and it does exist from its own side. Prasanghikas disagree with that. Does that answer your question though, or no? I'm not sure if I fully answered it.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to go any further. It seems like they make a distinction between right and wrong conventionalities.
Yeah, they do.
And how does that affect then the ultimate analysis, or does it?
Yeah, it's interesting, like, because from their perspective, right, like, actually it's quite, I'll go further into it maybe just because I think, I get where I think I understand where you're heading with that, right, and, really, like, it's a subtle distinction, but there's a distinction there, so, from their perspective, right, they agree with the Prasangika, in the sense, they do a similar ultimate analysis, right, when they do an ultimate analysis, they, like if they do an ultimate analysis of the existence of a chair, they would agree that you don't find the chair. Right? When you engage in ultimate analysis, you don't find some kind of inherently existent. You don't find any truly existent chair. They would say that. Right? But then, from their perspective, when you come out of that state, right, of perceiving emptiness, again the chair appears. Now both would agree with that, right? But for the Svatantrika Madhyamakas, they would say, well, conventionally there has to be something that does inherently make a chair different than a cow. It has to somehow be there. Conventionally, they would say ultimately, okay, there's no ultimate difference. But conventionally, there has to be something from the side of the object intrinsically that makes it different from something else, right? And that it functions as that. Like the chair functions as a chair and you can't get milk from it, and the cow walks around, it doesn't stay still like a chair. So it was simplifying a bit. But so they would say, they're talking about conventionally, right? Conventionally, they would say there has to be something there from the side of the object, or in this case, or in some cases from the side of the subject of mind perceiving it, but that exists, let's say it right, that functions in accordance with its appearance, and that exists inherently, is the way they would put it. And they would say, otherwise, you can't, otherwise, like, if I think chair, suddenly there should be a chair there or something. It's not, they would say there has to be something inherently there that makes it conventionally exist in that way. Ultimately, it's not findable. They would agree, right?
Okay, so it doesn't affect the ultimate analysis at all, it's just on the conventional side.
Yeah, that's the main difference actually, is that Svatantrika Madhyamikas say conventionally things do have a certain kind of inherent nature. And that ultimately that nature is not findable. Prasangikas actually say, well, as soon as you say conventionally there is something inherent there, you've already engaged in ultimate analysis. Now you're asserting an ultimate. Once you assert an ultimate conventionally, that is your ultimate status. You don't then, there is no such thing as emptiness then. You've asserted that it's ultimately chair, that there's something ultimately chair there. You've now engaged in some kind of ultimate analysis because you're addressing its ultimate, its existential status, its ultimate nature. So you've already asserted that. So now you can't say that it's ultimately empty in the sense that we mean it. Does that make sense? So that's the difference.
Yeah.
Does that get at the question more deeply?
Thank you. Is it possible to explain this or comment on this from the perspective of like mental afflictions and mental perspectives? Because
See what you mean?
like you've been talking about like sensory or like the way we see it or like physical objects, but I'm also interested about like how it affects our even mental afflictions like the afflicted states of mind like anger and so on. Is it possible to explain like the stuff that you've been talking about through an example of such afflictions, mental afflictions and mental perceptions instead of like physical objects? Because
Sure.
I mean, of the six senses, mind is one of the senses, and you were talking about that earlier. I'm curious about how an example would apply to this discussion.
Sure, yeah. So like in this case, mental events would have the same. One point is that it's actually quite interesting, isn't it? Like, from this perspective, mental events have the same existential status as physical events. Is one point. But then, to more directly address your point, like, so I'll give an example. Pick anger as the example, right? Like, so anger. First of all, so anger is a conventional truth. Right? In other words, then, why is it a conventional truth, right? Well, one is you could just say simply because it appears to the mind, right? When a person's angry, their anger appears to their own mind, right? And part of the definition of conventional truth, right? And it appears in a way that's different than how it truly actually exists, right? It appears one way, but it doesn't exist in the way it appears. And what you mean by that, right, is that so actually it's quite easy with anger, isn't it? Because when you get really angry, right, like, actually our anger seems like, actually if you're very angry, anger really seems, first of all, it certainly seems truly existent, right? It seems like it exists in some kind of real way. It seems, and part of what he's getting at here is the same as with same as with external objects, right? So the anger appears to be truly existent, but it's not truly existent, right? Which means it does exist conventionally, right? But its ultimate nature is emptiness. That's part of it, Which means what? That it appears to be truly existent, but it's empty of such true existence. It only arose due to causes and conditions. Yeah, so that's the simple answer. To get a little more subtle, though, we start to get. I'm just contemplating. He doesn't say this here. I'm just sort of contemplating myself, but it's actually quite interesting, isn't it? Because when you're angry, like let's say I'm really angry at somebody, right? And then this is just my own position now. That's not Lama Tsongkhapa doesn't say this, but I'm just going to present my own position on this point. The anger is a conventional truth object. It is because it exists. right? It exists conventionally, it appears to a person's consciousness. Now, if I'm really angry at somebody, what happens actually, right, is, especially if I'm very angry, right, is I kind of start thinking about that person, right? I think, oh, there. I make up a mental image of that person. Now, what I would suggest, personally believe is true, is that going back to what he did on the previous page, right? I'm just my own, like, does my version of the person I'm angry at, I would argue, doesn't even exist conventionally. In other words, that's a complete fabrication. You know, he's talking about what do you call it? Sense powers, or in this case, the mental conscious that's afflicted by a cause of error. I would argue extreme anger is an example of that. This is just my own position, so I'm just explaining. So I would say the object of that anger, in my mind, right, the mental, like my story, my image of that person, doesn't even exist conventionally. Because later, it's often happened, doesn't it? If you get really angry at somebody, you think they're like this and this and this, and then if you get to know them again, or you calm down, you know, you talk to them and you realize, oh, they're not at all who I was exaggerating, right? I made up this whole scenario that they're this terrible person, but really maybe I was wrong partly. I made, so what I would suggest is oftentimes when we're very angry, the object of the anger that we're sort of relating to in our mind doesn't even exist conventionally, but the anger exists conventionally. Does that make sense? Just like with the reflection in the mirror example he gave, right? The reflection doesn't exist does the face exist out there? No, not even conventionally, right? But the reflection exists conventionally. So I'm just saying, I think it's a little similar in a way that oftentimes when we make, or if somebody like falls madly in love with somebody, right? Like crazy in love, you could say, does the object of their attachment, it's not actually love from a Buddhist perspective, does the object of their attachment even exist conventionally? I would personally say no. They're so exaggerated that they have an idea that doesn't exist anywhere conventionally, right? If they say, oh, this person's so perfect and they're the most beautiful, whatever, like most wonderful or whatever, like I would argue that object doesn't even exist conventionally, but the attachment exists conventionally, right? So I'm just drawing an interest. I just think that's useful.
And then we can also do the analysis, I guess, from both an ultimate perspective and a conventional perspective on such topics too, which might be another point of discussion.
Yeah, and one point there is that, so we can get back to what Lama Tsongkhapa was saying then, that ultimately, like the mental image of the person I'm so attached to is, is it an error? And also the way I perceive my own attachment is an error. Right? If you do an ultimate analysis, you'll find even the attachment itself doesn't exist as it appears. Right? But conventionally it does exist. So I'm just distinguishing those. Yeah.
So what is the difference between what you just, the analyzation portion of it, to different from the Chittamatra point of view?
The Chittamatra point of view. You're not asking Svatantra, you're asking actual Chittamatra perspective.
No, so I don't understand the difference between Yogacara and Chittamatra. Are they the same thing?
Oh, they're the same, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, no, but and I was differentiating. There's the actual Chittamatra school, and then within the Madhyamaka, there's a sub school that's called the Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamaka. But that's different than the actual Chittamatra
But the
school.
Yogacara is saying that due to your karma, that is presenting objects due to your karma in the way that your karma will then experience things, which is the concealer portion.
Well, actually, I mean, all Buddhists, Madhyamikas would also say how things appear to you is in part due to your karma, though. So they would all agree on that.
So clearly I don't understand.
But you're clear.
Missed it. But I got that part. Just who knows it.
Yeah, because the Madhyamaka would also say how things appear to you is due to your karma. Like, you have the karma to be human versus the karma to be a hungry ghost versus the karma to be some other kind of being. and things appear differently because of your karmas. They would all agree on that.
Okay, but I misunderstood the difference between the schools.
So that's, okay. So that, oh, sorry.
May I clarify something as a physician about jaundice?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it's
That I
just
don't know
an
much about.
example,
Yeah.
but jaundice is due to deposits of bilirubin in the sclera of the
Ah.
eye, which is the white part, not in the part that has to do with eyesight. So it does not affect your vision.
Oh, so what's the
When you
disease?
look at a person, you see their eyes being.
Oh, their eyes look.
Yes.
What's the thing that makes things externally look a different color?
I can speak.
That
My
is the wrong-
experience is that cataracts can cause that also.
Oh, okay. I don't know that. Yeah, that's my ignorance. Okay, so jaundice just makes your eyes look yellow. It doesn't make objects
Correct,
appear yellow.
that's correct.
So there's some other
Colorblindness.
color blindness changes the external color. Yeah.
Yellow
That's
blindness.
interesting. Anyway, thanks for clarifying.
Sometimes the aura of migraines can cause people to see colors. It could be yellow or other colors.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I can't think of other examples right
Okay. Because they sometimes there must be a mistranslation. Some Buddhist texts they talked about that way, but it must be a mistranslation of whatever the term is.
now. There was a jaundice translation.
Yeah, yeah. I think so. Thanks for clarifying. That's good.
It's wrong convention.
Right, even conventionally, my assertion that jaundice is incorrect. Ultimately, they will both be. Okay. So next paragraph, the exception that conventional valid condition cannot posit the opposite of the mode of it. So this next paragraph, I'll actually read it just because it's kind of fun. Conventional valid cognition does not establish the opposite of, for instance, one of the two apprehensions of persons and phenomena established through their own character. The mode of apprehension arising from the mind's being temporarily polluted by one of the bad tenets. This is an exception. So what he's getting at there is this, he pointed out that when let's see if I say this right, like when we have, there are certain kinds of wrong perceptions, I could say, or wrong apprehensions, that he's been talking about that are because we have some kind of cause of error from our own side, right? Like, and he gave the example, whatever the disease, cataracts, let's use, or some kind of auditory problem, or some kind of, tactile problem, something like that, right? And what he's saying is, first he's pointing out all those kinds of wrong conventional, like where somebody thinks they're perceiving something conventionally, and then but it doesn't actually even exist conventionally, right? And what he's saying is, the vast majority of such misapprehensions can be corrected by by somebody else's or by your own subsequent correct conventional valid cognition, right? So like, you get whatever the condition you have healed, and then you look again and you see, oh, it's like that. Or you talk to somebody you trust and they say, oh, you're seeing it wrong, and so on, right? So usually a conventional valid cognition can correct a wrong appearance, that appears to a worldly mind. But now what he's saying is, there's one instance that's an exception to that, which is conventional minds, and here he's getting, have an appearance or an apprehension of inherently existent persons and inherently existent phenomena, right? Phenomena established by way of their own character. Like if I look at Jodi, I have this apprehension of a truly existent, inherently existent Jodi, existent by way of her own character. And that's appearing to a conventional consciousness. And what he's saying is, all other misapprehensions can be corrected through conventional correct. That one can't be, right? Because all conventional consciousnesses are going to continue to wrongly perceive Jodi as existent by way of her own character. That, although that object doesn't exist conventionally, right? It can only be corrected by an ultimate analysis, and by an ultimate consciousness. So by seeing the emptiness of Jodi, which is an ultimate analysis, that can be corrected. Does that make sense? But you can't correct that with another conventional consciousness. Like you can't shake your head and go, oh, maybe she doesn't, it doesn't work because she'll continue to appear that way. You can only correct that when you engage in an ultimate analysis. So he's saying that's one example of that's the one example, or two examples, I guess, persons and phenomena. So oneself and then other, oneself is the persons, right? And then one's own aggregates or external objects can be the phenomena, right? That the apprehension of those as truly existent or existent by way of their own character and so on, that can only be corrected by ultimate analysis, not by conventional analysis. Does that make sense? Okay. And so actually, I just want to point out here, what he's getting at though, if you start to look at this, right, in these two paragraphs, right, he's starting to explore, well, how do we know what's, like how does the Prasangika system allow for a differentiation between what exists conventionally and what does not exist conventionally? And he's saying one way is conventional, subsequent conventional analyses, right? The first paragraph said that, right? If somebody discovers, oh, I have a disease, I was misperceiving things, the room seemed like it was spinning, right? Oh, I had a fever. The room wasn't actually spinning. Okay, I understand. I need to take something to reduce my fever, right? That's the example of the first kind, right? Then he's saying there's another issue around whether something even exists at all conventionally, and that's if it can't withstand, if it's corrected by an ultimate analysis, then it didn't exist conventionally. Right? Anyway, we're going to get into more distinctions about that though, because that's a subtle point, which we'll talk about more in some work soon. Okay, then he says, another point. This one I'll just cover briefly. He says, moreover, although dualistic appearances occur for the exalted wisdom knowing the varieties, free from all causes of pollution by predispositions of ignorance, it is not mistaken with regard to its appearing objects. The reason has been explained elsewhere. So he's not going to get into that here. I don't think, since he's not going into detail, maybe I'll just say very, very brief about that. There he's talking about a Buddha, right? He's saying Buddhas, right? Part of the Buddha, we say Buddha's omniscient, right? So Buddha sees emptiness directly, which is the ultimate truth. But Buddhas also perceive, what does he call it here? The varieties. He sometimes call it, Buddhas have a direct perception of the limitless variety of existent phenomena, you could say. And so what he's saying here is, in the case of Buddhas, those conventionality, existent phenomena, conventionally existent phenomena, appear to them, but not in a mistaken manner. So that's what he's saying there. Right? They appear in an unmistaken manner. That's what he's saying in brief. I mean, there's more philosophically about that, but I don't think we need to get into it because he doesn't agree.
This may be going off the track, but how do they distinguish between a vision and a hallucination in terms of, because a lot of people in the world would say people who have visions are actually hallucinating, but from a practitioner's point of view, we may say no, in fact they did actually see that.
It's an interesting question, one point one point that's very clear, I'll start with this one because it's the easy part of the answer, is in both cases, unless it's like if an ordinary person has a vision, right, and another ordinary, it's still, even if it's a vision, not a hallucination, if we call it that, it still appears in a certain way and doesn't exist that way, right? So it's still empty, for example, right? But then it becomes an interesting question, so ultimately it's a mistake, in that sense, from a Prasangika point of view, it's mistaken. Right? But then what you're getting at is a different question, right, which is conventionally, now one thing, it's interesting, one thing Chandrakirti would say, right, is that's a worldly question, right? That's a question for the world, in a sense, right? No, meaning that's not a question for ultimate analysis. That's one point, right? And then I'll just share, like, so that's actually the primary Prasangika answer to that question. But then I guess, you know, if you look at taking the example of Lama Tsongkhapa's own life story, you know, since he's the author of this text, what you see is like that. So that's one point, is that's not a question for ultimate analysis, right? But then from a conventional analysis perspective, there's a famous example where Lama Tsongkhapa was like, you know, kind of a fairly young, great scholar, you know, had already written some books and was a very respected sort of practitioner and scholar. And I was like, I think it's funny. Professor Bob Thurman, I just find this funny. He says, like, he's trying to give an analogy. So he says, you know, and he was a professor at Columbia, right, University. So he sort of says, like imagine, like, you know, I don't know, like from an academia perspective, like one of the greatest young scholars in the nation who's sort of like getting offered tenure at Harvard and Yale and Princeton. And then a cowherd shows up, a Kagyu yogi cowherd, yak herder, probably, I guess, yak herder shows up, right, named Umapa, and says, Manjushri told me to come find you and tell you some things. Right? And of course Lama Tsongkhapa was initially quite skeptical, right, like, who is this guy, you know, something, like, and then, but actually then he does what we're talking about, he does a conventional analysis. And what we mean is, like, he since he was one of the greatest scholars already, I mean, he became a much better scholar as he went along, according to the tradition, but he started asking questions that he thought almost nobody can answer. And this guy would sort of ask the question of Manjushri and then tell him, well, Manjushri says this. And Lama Tsongkhapa became quite impressed because he said, well, the answers were more subtle and more discerning than he could come up with or than his teachers could come up with. And he kept doing that, so he kept testing, I guess, Umapa. And finally he came to this conclusion that he said, like, I believe these are valid visions or something, because the answers he's giving are better than the answers. But then actually it's an interesting point. Like, so he went into like retreat, and then he left, and they said, Bob Thurman says, everybody freaked out. Like, as you can imagine, like, if like the dean of Harvard left to go sit in a cave somewhere, everybody would think you're nuts, right? Like, so people kind of freaked out. But he left with Umapa and like went in retreat and was asking all these questions and meditating. But even so, I think this is very much Lama Tsongkhapa, I think, just my own perspective, is he then said, I think is very, very typical of Lama Tsongkhapa, because he's such a kind of discerning, he always wanted to get further, right? So he says to Umapa, at some point he says to Umapa, well, ask Manjushri how I can see him directly, and ask the questions myself. You know, because he wants to be certain, right? And then, so Umapa asks and says, well, do this practice and do this retreat, and here's how you do it, and blah, blah, blah. And then Lama Tsongkhapa does that, and then he starts having visions of Manjushri himself and starts asking him questions directly. And
So you got rid of the middleman.
he got rid of the middleman. And so then he had his own, what's the word? So actually, and that would be part of it, though, right? It's like, if you look at how do you discern, right? First he did it through reasoning, and then he did it through direct perception for himself, like, is the idea. But, so that would be, so the Buddhists in general, I think, are quite, I mean, Tibetan Buddhists are kind of funny that way, where actually it goes back to India, though, too, right? Because they're like, you know, the great treatises of Maitreya came to Asanga essentially through a vision, you could say, right? He had a vision of Maitreya. So it's not just Tibetan, but the Buddhist tradition tends to be, that is the way it tends to do it. Like, it tends to be very critical initially. Like, I was just reading a story where, like, somebody was, it was a lama in Tibet who was not a Gelugpa lama, but so who had claimed to have realized, like, termas. You know, Nyingma tradition has these termas, right, where somebody can discover a terma, and like whether it be in a rock or in a temple or in their own mind, kind of. And at first, everybody was very critical, like saying, you know, basically saying, oh, you're full of crap, kind of thing. You know? And then it had to withstand, like, you know, they had to go to the great scholars and present it. And they had to kind of say, well, either reject it or accept it based on. And I think that seems to be, you know, there was a tradition. Somebody once told me this story. A couple people told me. in ancient India there was a tradition where somebody composed something, whether it was based on their own understanding or in a vision. At Nalanda, they had to present it to like a, Nalanda's, right, where Dalai Lama always emphasizes Nalanda tradition, and all the great, Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti and Asanga, they all came from taught at Nalanda. But the story was that whether somebody had a vision or their own insight, and they composed a text, that they had to present it to like a, what's it called, like a panel of scholars. And if the scholars felt it wasn't valid, then the way they would give the answers, they would attach, I don't know whether the whole text or just the title page, to the tail of a dog, and the dog would run, and the papers would scatter, and then that was the sign that this wasn't worth reading by anybody else. So that'd be like worse than getting a rejection letter from your publisher.
Yeah.
Like, more embarrassing. So I think that's the idea of how, like, whether it's a visionary text or whether it's a your own text, the idea is that it should be subjected to reasoning, an analysis, and that it should never be accepted just because somebody says they had a vision, or even just because they believe it, actually. But that it should withstand, it should be in accordance with the teachings of the Buddha, it should withstand analysis by other scholars and practitioners and so on. So I think that's the idea. Okay. So now we enter the next session, which is ultimate truths, right? We finished the section on conventional truths. They're related, as a number of people pointed out, but now we're on the section ultimate. So now he begins the section on ultimate truths. He's going to start with an explanation of the meaning of the word ultimate and the meaning of the word truth in this context, right? And I'll just share, like I actually checked. So the Sanskrit for ultimate here is paramartha. And the param part is the same as paramita. So you're familiar with it's that same part of a word. And then truth, as earlier, is satya. Right? So people are familiar with that if you remember Gandhi, right? Satya. How do you say satyagraha or satyagriha? I can't remember. His method, right, which was that was his non-violent method.
Well, there was ahimsa.
Ahimsa, yeah.
Non-violent.
But the satya meant truth and
just truth.
satya was truth, and graha was I can't remember the translation of that now. Anyway, yeah, I mean ahimsa means, but that was his whole method, right? It was sort of anyway. I can't remember the details now. But okay, so here. He's going to get it. So first we're going to define ultimate. So he says, and if you read, he's quoting Chandrakirti, who wrote in Sanskrit, so he's analyzing that word paramartha. So he says, it is an object and it is ultimate. Therefore it is the ultimate object. I want to clarify something. So the object part of that is the artha in paramartha. So he's literally saying part of the word means object. So he says, and the other part of the word, and ultimate, they sometimes translate it as ultimate or sublime or highest or supreme in this context. So it's the supreme object, right, or the ultimate object or the sublime object. Does that make sense? So the paramartha part, the ultimate, so that ultimate means ultimate object, actually, meaning ultimate object of a consciousness. And then he says, since it's true, it is the ultimate object truth. So he's saying if you were to do a literal, we ordinarily say ultimate truth, but he's saying if you were to literally translate the whole Sanskrit term, it would be ultimate object truth, because the artha is there. So then he says, how it is true. The way in which an ultimate truth is true is its non-deceptiveness. Specifically, it does not deceive the world, abiding in one way and appearing in a different way. In Chandrakirti's commentary on the 60 stanzas of reasoning, it says that an ultimate truth is merely posited as existent by the power of worldly conventions. So I want to, actually I'm going to read the next paragraph too, and then the next sentence too, and then I'll explain. That being so, the meaning of the word truth in conventional truth, which is truth in a perspective of the apprehension of true existence, and the meaning of the word truth in ultimate truth are not the same. So there are a number of points here. One is, you get that point, right? Truth here means non-deceptive. It means it exists exactly as it's perceived, as it is. Like, actually the way it's appearing to that consciousness and the way it exists are completely congruent. And so that's the meaning of truth in this context. And he's saying that's different from the meaning of truth in conventional truth, which we addressed earlier. Because in conventional truth, it's truth for a mind that of ignorance, actually, right? So it means it doesn't appear in the way it doesn't exist in the way it appears. So here, true means a different thing. It means actually true. Now, he's saying here, though, language ultimate truth. And now we're going to get into something. We're going to start to get into something quite important, I guess, which is ultimate truth in the way it's being used in this teaching, in the Madhyamaka teachings. You know, we've been talking about from what perspective, right? Lama Tsongkhapa was doing that. So conventional truths, right? He talked about as existing. Conventional truths he talked about as existing from the perspective of ignorance, right? Mere conventionalities, we could say, are a little different, but conventional truths, right, were true from the perspective of a mind of ignorance. Here, ultimate truth is not from the perspective of ignorance. Right? Ultimate truth is from the perspective of the meditative absorption directly realizing emptiness in the mind of an Arya. So what's an Arya? Somebody who's seen emptiness directly. Right? And then an ultimate truth isn't just any perception by such a person. It's their perception of emptiness while they're in meditative absorption, directly realizing the nature of ultimate truth, directly realizing the nature of emptiness. So it's not something that exists from the perspective of ignorance. Does that make sense? It's something that exists from the perspective of a wisdom consciousness, of a certain kind of person. And then, though, he's going to say, one point is, one can only approach that, though, in the previous paragraph regarding how it's true, he says, and he's going to get into this more a little bit later in the text, but he's saying a couple of things. One is, and yet we're talking about it, right? So one point where you can say is, when we're talking about it from the perspective of a dualistic mind of ignorance, right? And it's only through analyzing the mind that misperceives things that we eventually come to a perception of ultimate truth. So he said, so it's by relying on analyzing conventional truth and seeing how it's false that we come to realize ultimate truth. Does that make sense? So in actuality, ultimate truth, the real meaning of ultimate truth, in other words, what we actually are really meaning when we use that term is something from the perspective of a wisdom mind, of a meditative absorption on emptiness. But we're going to talk about it, and when we talk about it, we're talking about it from the perspective of mind of ignorance, which is not. So it's interesting. So when we talk about ultimate truth, of course, let's see what we say, right? We're talking about it in conventional terms, I guess you could say. We're talking about it in conventional terminology, but that's not the actual meaning of ultimate truth. Does that make sense?
We're going to surround it.
What's that?
We're going to surround it.
And hopefully we'll have victory, we'll invade. But okay, so now the definition of an ultimate truth, the actual definition. The definition of an ultimate truth is as explained above, which we just said. In the commentary of the middle way, it is said to be that which is found by seeing the meaning of a real object of knowledge. In the commentary on that, it says, that is to say, the ultimate gains its own entity through being the object of the special exalted wisdom of those who perceive reality, but it is not established by way of its own selfhood. This is one nature. So I want to explain that. So first of all, that's Chandrakirti talking, writing. And he's saying, so one point where he says special exalted wisdom of those who perceive reality, right? Those who perceive reality means Aryas, right? people who have actually perceived reality directly. Then he's saying special exalted wisdom, because even Aryas, I've talked about this before, right? They're not always in meditative absorption on the ultimate nature of reality, right? Sometimes they're talking to somebody or teaching or whatever, having lunch or something like that. And at that time, they're not in a state of directly perceiving ultimate truth, right? But he's saying it's, so what is the ultimate gains its own entity through being the object of the special exalted wisdom of the, so it's that special state of mind, you could say, special in the sense of, it's this special state of mind that they're in, which is when they're in meditative absorption on emptiness. Then he makes an interesting point here. He says, it gains its own entity. Now here he's saying, it gains its own entity in the sense that it exists from that perspective. But then he says, but it's not established by way of its own selfhood, right? That means emptiness is also empty, right? That's what he's saying there. And I'll read the commentary and then I'll make more comment. So he said, Lama Tsongkhapa now is talking. It is said to be found by the uncontaminated, exalted wisdom comprehending suchness. That's very clear, right? That's the mind that sees ultimate truth. An uncontaminated, exalted wisdom comprehending suchness. Suchness or emptiness or things as they are, thatness, there are different translations. And is not established, and not to be established by way of its own entity. So the proposition that something is established as truly existent if found by an uncontaminated meditative equipoise is being refuted. Right, so he's saying, just because emptiness, I've said this before, emptiness is the ultimate truth, but it's not ultimately existent. That's what he's saying now, right? He's saying, it's an interesting point, right? Because you could see how somebody could think that, right? In other words, if it's found by an ultimate mind, in a sense, somebody would think it must be ultimately existent. You can see how a person could think that, right? Mm-hmm. If somebody says it's the ultimate truth, it exists as it appears to, there's no gap between, there's no falseness. In other words, it's true in the sense that it exists as it appears, right? So you could see how somebody could think, well, then it must be inherently existent, or it's true, so it must be truly existent, in a sense. And he's saying that it's not established as truly existent. He said that's the exact phrase he uses. Should I say something? Maybe I'll say something a little confusing on purpose.
It's not confusing.
Not that
Because if you're not confused, yeah.
Confused but
Something
confused.
ultimately confusing, please.
Yeah. I'm trying to be more confused. It's an interesting point, right? It's found by ultimate analysis, right?
Right.
So how does it not ultimately exist?
It's,
We covered that.
Yeah. So what's the answer?
It's just that the one does not imply the other.
it's,
And also,
It's a
that's
lack.
that's like a language trick also.
That's all.
is it uncompounded phenomena like
Because I already went through
emptiness?
this discussion in my head.
Yeah, emptiness is an uncompounded. Emptiness perceived here is an uncompounded. That's right.
But is ultimate truth uncompounded phenomena or compounded phenomena?
Uncompounded. Because it's an emptiness, right? It's a form of, it's an example of emptiness, so it's an uncompounded.
But you're
'Cause it is an
talking about
emptiness.
the conception of the ultimate truth, right?
At that time, it's non-conceptual
Mm.
perception, right? If it's direct perception, that means it's non-conceptual. It's direct perception at this time,
Okay, so that's confusing.
right? Because part of the definition here is
No
it's
idea
direct
what a
perception.
direct perception really is.
So is there anything ultimately existent? I think we've asked this question before, I don't remember the answer.
Yeah, according to Buddhism, no.
Yeah, okay. It all depends on causes and conditions.
Yeah, everything
Depends
depends on
on
cause
the
and
horizon.
condition. Yeah, everything is dependent.
The term ultimately existent, is that the same as inherently existent?
Yeah, in this context, I'm using it. There would be synonyms.
Can you say that one more time?
Ultimately existent, ultimate, is that really a thing, ultimate existent? What did I just say?
I think you said it's something ultimately existent, a synonym for being inherently
Inherently
existent, and I said yes.
Yes.
The way I'm using the terms, yes.
So, but an ultimate truth is not ultimately existent.
Right.
Mhm.
Let's just
Okay.
leave it there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, you had
I mean, yeah, okay.
Linda, you had a comment
Yeah,
there.
well, I was just, I know I have read, but I probably misunderstood or the terminology was different. But it was definitely someone who was in that tradition. But that there was, I know from your teaching, and of course that this is not so, but I have read that there is such a thing as, I wouldn't say it, I don't even know how to say it, but that what you're saying is not existent, or that is existent. There is, on some level, there actually is something that it exists.
It is ultimately existing.
Yeah.
That is ultimately exist, because there are things that exist. That
No, I mean,
well,
that it ultimately exists. I know, but I know I must have misread it. And I
Is that
even
the
asked this
Yogacara
of a teacher,
system?
not Pandra Rinpoche. I did not, but someone who studied with her a long time, and he said that because I think you've always said that emptiness relies on causes and conditions. That's right. I mean,
we'll get into it actually more. Lama Tsongkhapa will address it more in the next page actually. But I want to say a comment. I don't know what you were reading, of course, that day. But
yeah, I know.
but,
I was misreading it, or
but you might not be. I'll just make a comment.
Oh,
Like
okay.
I mean, you may be misreading. You may not be. So I want
it's
to.
like Rigpa, in other words, in another.
I'll say is.
Rigpa is the ultimate mind, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one point I'll make, just because, again, because you guys, I mean, we all read different things, and
Yeah.
someone complained about this, like, Lama Tsongkhapa in this text actually has addressed some of this, and so, seriously, it's right. Like, I actually just, I'll just share, like, I think because it might be similar. Just the other day, I was reading, I think it was a text, I guess, about or by Zhanggang Hongzhou the Great, right? Who was I guess mostly a Kagyu, but a Rimei teacher, right? Who mostly practiced Kagyu and Nyingma teachings. And he, in terms of the view of emptiness, he was what they call, he held the view that they call other emptiness, right? Which Lama Tsongkhapa strongly disagrees with. So I mean, and it's quite, I mean, I like, it's quite wonderful in many ways, like I really, but in terms of the philosophy, so in terms of specifically his view, I'm just picking him as the example because I was reading it just the other day, but in terms of like and he was a practitioner of various, I mean, Mahamudra and Dzogchen and many other tantric practices, many things, but in terms of the philosophical view, right, he and Lama Tsongkhapa would completely disagree about this point, because his position would be, I think, as I understand it, that because there was, and in general, the holders of that position, which in Tibet is called other emptiness, have this view that the ultimate is ultimately existent, and it's empty of all conventional appearances. That's a brief summary of their one tenet of their view. So that there's a kind of an ultimate that's ultimately existent, truly existent, inherently existent, that's empty of all conventionalities. And Lama Tsongkhapa says that's a misunderstanding of Madhyamaka. That's not a correct understanding of Madhyamaka. I'll share a couple of thoughts on that, just because while we're talking, like, I've heard His Holiness Dalai Lama has addressed that, because he's great. I mean, he's both he's a practitioner of all the traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, and also knows Lama Tsongkhapa's philosophy as well as anybody alive. And he makes a couple of interesting points. One is like, So the Lama's position is that I don't want to get too, I'm sort of pausing, I don't want to get too technical right now, we could get too far afield, but so the Lama's position is quite interesting, which is that there are certain subtle conventional phenomena, like the most subtle nature of mind, conventional nature of mind, which is a conventional truth, according to Prasangika perspective, which, if you study in tantric teachings, is, what's the word to say? Which, when experienced, is empty of all conventional appearances. And so Sonia says that's quite similar. It doesn't have any, when you experience that most subtle mind of innate clear light, which is an experience in highest yoga tantra in the completion stage, but also seems, from at least the way the Lingpa Lamas talk about it, is similar to what's experienced in Dzogchen. That mind, when you're experiencing it, is empty of conventional appearances, in the sense it's too subtle to have those appearances. But the unique position of Lama Tsongkhapa, which is different than, say, Jungwon Kongtrul the Great, would be that even that most subtle, which they sometimes call ultimate mind, even, or primordial mind, for example. Lama Tsongkhapa and other, not just Lama Tsongkhapa, but other scholars, I guess, of the Prasangika school would say that is also empty of inherent existence. But some scholars don't take that position. So so it's possible you misunderstood, but it's also possible that somebody who was writing that particular whatever you were reading was talking from an other emptiness perspective. What's that? Shengtong in Tibet, yeah. And that would be, and then and that's there are many very that's why I gave the example. That's why I gave the example of Jungwon Kongtrul the Great. He's a highly respected teacher, and he held that position. So it's not to. I'm using him as an example in part not to disparage that position. But Lama Tsongkhapa differs with it. He would say even the most subtle mind is empty of inherent existence. Even the Buddha's mind is empty of inherent existence. And he clearly follows Chandrakirti. So Chandrakirti also. Lama Tsongkhapa very closely follows and agrees with Chandrakirti's perspective on emptiness, which is Chandrakirti is the most historically important, maybe, exemplar of the Prasangika school. So that would so it might be a difference of philosophical view at that point. That's possible.
That's a question. So those subtle differences that you're explaining, which I cannot even comprehend, does that, if someone has that subtle kind of difference in understanding, does Lama Tsongkhapa say whether they can can they reach enlightenment? Is it an obstacle to enlightenment? Maybe not emptiness, but
Lama Tsongkhapa, actually I'll say, I think, first of all, from Lama Tsongkhapa's perspective, he clearly says, and believes and says clearly in many points in his text that, and this is really the issue that we're getting at in a way, is, I think I've used this term before, but Lama Tsongkhapa's view, explanation, position, is that emptiness is what they call usually they sometimes call it a mere negation or a non-affirming negation. What that means is that when one engages in what we're calling ultimate analysis, right, there comes one finds the object to be refuted, right, the object of negation. One engages in an analysis to see whether it exists or doesn't exist, and one gains a realization that it does not exist. And at that time, that negation doesn't imply anything else. It's just a kind of simple negation, right, you could call it. That's not, because there are sometimes, so this is a funny example, they say, there are negations that imply something else. Like, so for example, if they say, they usually give this example, they say, the example they give essentially in Tibetan, this is the Tibetan example, they say, if you have a very, very fat coworker who always eats, they say, my very, very fat coworker never eats lunch. the implication is they eat a big dinner, right? It's implying something else. And what they're saying here, it's just a simplistic example, but in other words, there's some negations that you say it doesn't do this, but it implies it does do that. Right? But here, emptiness from Lama Tsongkhapa's perspective is, and which is exactly what we're talking about, right? When you engage in this ultimate analysis, does the self that seems to exist intrinsically actually exist or not? And then there comes a point where you gain a realization that that intrinsic self doesn't exist. And that realization doesn't imply that something else does exist. It's just a simple negation that one's mind becomes absorbed in. And Lama Tsongkhapa is saying that everyone has to at some point have that realization to become a Buddha. One interesting point I'll make is that the first Panchen Lama, Losен Choki Gyaltsen, who was a follower of Lama Tsongkhapa in many ways, also a non-sectarian teacher, and he wrote a text in Lama Tsongkhapa's tradition on Mahamudra. And he makes this point where he says, there's a famous line which I won't quote exactly, but he essentially says, you know, whether you're practicing, you know, what's labeled Madhyamaka reasoning, or you can label it Mahamudra, and there are different sub-traditions of these. So he gives these examples: amulet box Mahamudra, or possessing 5 Mahamudra, or this. I mean, there are many, many traditions of Mahamudra. And then he says, or Dzogchen, which you were mentioning. He says, whether you're practicing any of those traditions, if you're both have a deep reasoning understanding of Buddhist philosophy and a practice understanding, an understanding from the perspective of practice, then you'll discover, if you practice correctly, that they all come to the same point, that they all come to the same realization. And it was an interesting point, like in the Dalai Lama's commentary on Mahamudra, I think it's quite funny. He says, the first Panchen Lama said that because he was this great yogi, right, who was a teacher of the 4th and 5th Dalai Lamas, both, and was probably one of the greatest teachers of all time, and that's why he has the second. It was because of him, really, that like the Dalai Lamas and then the Panchen Lamas are considered the 2 most important historical lamas of Tibetan history. It's really because of him, actually. He was such a great, I mean, he was a towering figure. And he had practiced all those traditions, and he said, in my experience, they all come to the same point. They said then, like, I thought it was very funny, it's only the Dalai Lama in his commentary that says, then there's a text by, like, I can't remember if it was the 2nd or the 3rd Panchen Lama, who said, the first Panchen Lama said this, but I can't understand it. You know, like, which was quite funny, because it's so hard, actually. How do you fit an affirming negation and an honor, right? Because the other emptiness is an affirming negation. They're saying you can negate, but then they're affirming something that's truly existed. Anyway, I don't know if he was talking about that, but as long as the Dalai Lama said, I thought it was very sweet. As long as the Dalai Lama was saying, well, this other Panchen Lama couldn't understand it, but here's what it means, you know. And then he explained it, which is very sweet, beautiful. But because he practices all those too, you know. But yeah. So anyway, from Lama Tsongkhapa's perspective, one has to come eventually to an experience of a direct perception of this non-affirming negation of true existence. And what his point is that he says in this text is, his view is this: is that there's a grasping at the cause of samsara, right, is a grasping at an inherently existent self. And if you don't have something that's an exact opposite of that, then you won't get rid of that. There is that the only antidote to this grasping at a truly existent I, is the recognition that that inherently existent I doesn't exist at all. And that when you realize that, it serves as an antidote that undermines the cause of suffering. Actually, if you read, like, I was just reading it, if you read Dharma Kirti's logic text, he says the same thing. He says, if you understand the nature of the Four Noble Truths, that the cause of suffering, I mean, on a superficial level, it's craving, but craving comes from ignorance, grasping at a self, right? As long as you have this craving, this grasping at an I, then you're going to crave for something. Maybe you just crave for this I to keep existing. And if you don't have an experience that directly contradicts the I that you're grasping at, then in some subtle way that I will continue, and then samsara will continue. So that's Lama Tsongkhapa's position. Just to answer your question. So Lama Tsongkhapa's position is that one has to have a perception that totally negates that in order to become free of it, and therefore free from samsara. Anyway, that's it. So, where did we go? Starts on that. Okay, so then it says, the words special exalted wisdom indicate that what is found by any wisdom of an Arya is not sufficient. Right, and that was what I said earlier. There are times, for example, where an Arya Bodhisattva, right, who's seen emptiness directly, let's say they're meditating on impermanence. Let's say they've left their meditative absorption on emptiness and they happen to be contemplating impermanence or compassion. Those are not ultimate truth, right? That mind of an Arya wouldn't be an ultimate truth. Does that make sense? If they're contemplating compassion or emptiness, or compassion or impermanence, rather, those are conventionally existent objects, not ultimate. Does that make sense? So he's saying not every mind of an Arya who's seen emptiness directly, even when they're meditating, not all those minds are ultimate truth. It's only when that kind of person is meditating on the ultimate nature of things, emptiness, that it's an ultimate truth. So that's why he says, instead, only what is found by the special exalted wisdom, the exalted wisdom that knows the mode, meaning the ultimate mode of things, right? The meaning of found is established by that consciousness. Right, and so it means that, so he's saying it's the thing that's found by or cognized by that consciousness. That's the ultimate truth. And then he says, okay, again, how does it find it? And then he gives this example of cataracts. And actually, I'll ask a question, like, he gives this, they often, Buddhist texts do this too. They say, someone with cataracts sees falling hairs. But is that actually what people with cataracts see? I'm not sure that's true.
They can be both. I don't think they're,
Because there are floaters for people who don't have cataracts.
yeah, I've had both. I got rid of my cataracts and I still got my floaters.
Okay, so I'm a little confused sometimes medically by this, that's what I was asking. Do you know that too, or?
Well, I mean, cataracts cause an obstruction to
Yeah.
the eyesight, and with that you can have different distortions of light and so forth, and perception. Claude Monet, the great impressionist painter, in later life he had cataracts, and he started really putting on many more colors, like
Wow.
his haystacks and so on. And his lily ponds became very blurry and so forth. But the thing about hairs, for instance, or a curtain, you can have that with falling on the retina, if you have the vitreous detachment, which with age is quite common, or it could be a sign of also retinal tear, or worse, retinal detachment. So it could be various things. And with floaters, you can have that too.
Okay, so
And floaters are just, when there's some vitreous detachment or some little bodies in there that float, that's really not
that's all
significant.
it doesn't, okay. So I'm not sure if cataracts, anyway, that's the word they use here, but anyway, in brief, what he's saying, he's talking about how does somebody see ultimate truth, right? So then he uses this example, and he uses the word cataracts, but basically what he's saying is, if somebody has an eye disease and they see something like, something that's floaters, let's say, for example, right? Or some other kind of appearance due to an eye disease, he's giving an analogy. That's like conventional truth objects, right? They appear one way, but they don't actually exist as they appear, right? There's not something actually floating out there. Then he's saying, the person who's totally cured, who has totally healthy eyes, doesn't have any such appearances at all, right? And then he's saying, the Arya Bodhisattva is like the person with healthy eyes. In other words, no appearances of true existence or inherent existence arise for them when they're in that meditative state. They just see clearly. So he's using that an analogy to point that it's like, that's why they call it, remember the path where you first see emptiness directly is called the path of seeing. I think it might be a little bit of a play on that wording even. But in the 5 paths, the path where you first see emptiness is called the path of seeing. So I think it's actually a little bit of a play on that. But anyway, the point is that he's just saying for the person who sees emptiness directly, there's no false appearances at all. There's just a clear seeing of reality. And then, so he says, not even the subtle dualistic appearance is perceived. It's like with the eyes of someone who does not have any cataracts. The nature perceived through this mode of perception is the ultimate truth. Right? So you used to get that point. So he's just saying the ultimate truth is where all false appearances have fallen away. And then he quotes commentary on the middle way. Where wrong entities such as falling hairs are imputed through the force of cataracts, one with pure eyes sees the nature of suchness. Suchness should be known here in the like manner. And the comment to that. Whatever inherent existence of aggregates and the like, those free from the dispositions of ignorance, the Buddhas perceive in a matter of those without cataracts, who don't have any false appearances. That's the ultimate truth. So in brief, it's all false appearances have stopped for the person who's seeing the ultimate truth. Right? And then the ultimate perceived in this manner is the ultimate nature of the two natures. Right? So there's the conventional nature and the ultimate nature. So he's saying that's the ultimate nature, which each and every phenomenon has. More specifically, it is both the naturally pure nirvana, which is the emptiness of inherent establishment of phenomena, and just the natural emptiness free from all different seeds of defilements. The nirvana, which is a true cessation. And so I want to point out a couple of, so one point he's making here is he's using synonyms, right? He's saying there's this phrase, naturally pure nirvana, and he's saying that's a synonym for this state of mind, this seeing directly of emptiness. And then he gets, I'm going to finish this little section here because it's quite, it's all connected. So he says, those statements mean, first he says, is nirvana also a conventional truth? It is so. Therefore, nirvana is only imputed as conventional truth. Anyway, what he's getting at here, I'll just explain this next paragraph because he talks about three truths and so on. What he's getting at, remember earlier I said, I pointed out, Lama Tsongkhapa pointed out, rather, you could say, that all phenomena can be subsumed under either conventional truths or ultimate truths, right? That's an exhaustive list. So here we could say, well, how do you, oftentimes there are four noble truths, right? So if a person were superficially just looking at it, they could say, what do you mean there's only two truths? There are four truths, right? So here he's saying, he's going to get at, how do you categorize the four noble truths into the two truths? Does that make sense? From a prasangika perspective, the first three noble truths are conventional truths. Right? Suffering, right? The truth of suffering is a conventional truth. Obviously, that's not hard to see, is it? The truth of the cause of suffering is a conventional truth. Right? We already said that. Your question about afflictive emotions addressed that, right? Ignorance, craving, grasping, hatred, and so on. Those are causes of samsara, right? And ignorance is the primary one. And those are all conventional truths, as we said, right? So the second noble truth is a conventional truth. The third noble truth, the path, right, is also a conventional truth, right? Because the path includes things like meditation on compassion, meditation on loving kindness, study, right livelihood, many different things. Those are all conventional truths, right? But then from a prasangika perspective, the fourth noble truth, right, the truth of cessation, is an ultimate truth. So the first three noble truths we categorized as conventional truths, all aspects of the conventional, and the fourth noble truth, the truth of cessation, is ultimate truth. From a prasangika perspective, actually, just a few weeks ago, I asked a question to Kenshin Rinpoche about this, because that's a unique tenet of the prasangika school, I should say. Because Svatantrika Madhyamikas say that cessation is the mind of a person who has realized emptiness and therefore has who's meditated, who's seen emptiness directly, and therefore, caused the cessation or destruction of the ability to give rise to certain mental afflictions, right? So that's that would be a conventional truth, isn't it? Because it's the mind. In other words, a mind that doesn't give rise to mental afflictions would be a mind, so that's a conventional truth, right? But from a Prasangika perspective, when they talk about cessation, they say it's the emptiness of that mind. So it's an ultimate truth. It's not the mind, it's the emptiness of the mind from their perspective. So that's why, from a Prasangika perspective, cessation is an ultimate truth because it's an emptiness. And here also Lama Tsongkhapa does this, makes another point, which is let's say it right, like a naturally pure nirvana, cessation, emptiness, right? These are all synonyms, right? And he's making this point, he's saying those are ultimate truths, right? I said this kind of earlier. Those are ultimate truths, which means they're, well, what are they referring to? They're referring to something realized from the perspective of an exalted, as we said earlier, a special exalted wisdom of an Arya Bodhisattva, right? And here he's saying, he's pointing at this point, do they exist conventionally? Right? He sort of raises this question. And what he's saying is, the actual ultimate truth only exists from the perspective of that kind of exalted mind, right? But we do talk about, in one sense, we do talk about the ultimate truth. And when we're, what's the way to say this right? Actually, I'm going to quote His Holiness Dalai Lama on this point to make it, I want to be very accurate. So here's what His Holiness Dalai Lama said. He said, in this sense of nirvana, right? Nirvana meaning the ultimate, what's the word? Ultimate cessation or ultimate truth, right? He says, nirvana is, and this is his commentary to this section. He says, nirvana is not a conventional truth, but the existence of nirvana is a conventional truth. And then he says, because nirvana itself is a cessation, which is an ultimate truth. But then he says, the mere existence of that nirvana, when it's known by a conventional mind, is conventional truth. Does that make sense? So, like, the actual, when you say what is nirvana, actually, it's not a conventional truth. It's an ultimate truth. Does that make sense? But, like, when somebody says the Buddha achieved nirvana, right? Or the Buddha, if the Buddha were having a discussion and said, "I've achieved nirvana," right? And then somebody else were to cognize that, would say, "Wow, he achieved nirvana," right? Or it's Tara that she achieved nirvana or something. But if an ordinary person were to cognize that, then, in other words, they're not cognizing nirvana. They're not actually cognizing nirvana, right? But they're cognizing that nirvana exists. Does that make sense? That's what he's saying. So in that sense, it becomes the existence of nirvana becomes a conventional truth object from that person's perspective, from that mind. Does that make sense? And they're misperceiving it at that point, right? Because they're thinking, "Oh, nirvana's like." Actually, we do that, right? We think, "Oh, nirvana must be like this," and it's not. Whatever we imagine nirvana to be is not it, because only somebody who's directly perceiving emptiness knows the nature of nirvana. There's a saying, actually a beautiful saying in the Prajnaparamita Sutra, where one of the Prajnaparamita, where the Buddha says, those who knew me by my form knew me not. The Buddha is the Dharmakaya. The Buddha is the Dharmata. The Buddha is the cognition of it. Whereas that it's somebody who sees emptiness directly who knows the Buddha. Right? Everybody else knows the Buddha incorrectly. That's what we're getting at here, right? Knows the Buddha as a conventional truth object, which means doesn't really know, right? Which means it's known from the perspective of ignorance. Actually, knowing the Buddha from the perspective of ignorance, isn't it? That would be. Not knowing the Buddha as an ultimate truth, right? Ultimate truth would mean when you see emptiness directly. Pause there. We have ask a question because we have about 7 or 8 minutes left. You would ask the question in an email. Do you want me to answer? I can answer it now. I meant to answer that today. Is that good? I'll do that. Yeah. So I'll leave off there in the teaching because it's related to the text. It's related to what we're talking about. So I'm going to leave off there for our actual discussion of it's related anyway. But you get the point of what he. So he, and he's going to continue on with further with ultimate truth. And I want to say next time, which is a beautiful. This actually what's coming up next. I just want to say this comment, then I'll get to the other question. The next section that's coming right after this is quite really beautiful. It really gets it. You know, I've often talked about in the past about how Lama Tsongkhapa is addressing the harmony of dependent origination and emptiness. But here in this next in this next part, I'll call it, he goes into this very beautiful description of how it actually shows why emptiness is empty. He really gets into how the only way to understand the ultimate truth is by understanding the nature of conventional truth. Does that make sense? And why is that true, and how is that true, and why these two are being presented together? You know, we've done a little technical, right, which we've had to do because it's technical material. But I just wanted to say that in the next class we're really going to get into this point about all this is very important. One is so that you understand how conventional things still exist, even when they don't exist ultimately. But the other is this understanding of that it's by understanding the conventional. And when you understand the conventional, that is deceptive, or is concealer, right? It conceals something. And when you really understand how it exists as a concealer, and then what does it conceal, then you've realized the ultimate truth, right? And then when you've realized the ultimate truth, you understand how conventional truths exist as concealers, right? And so actually, it's the understanding of these, I mean, from a practice perspective, I guess is what I'm mentioning, it's the understanding of these two allow one to practice effectively, and to understand emptiness without becoming nihilistic, and to understand the conventional without becoming, what's the word, an eternalist, a reifier, somebody who sort of asserts true existence. And then I'm just going to jump in, because I thought it was a good question, that's why I'll take a minute to just answer it. So Linda had asked also, you had asked a question about what's it called, the four extremes, right? On the email, didn't you email me about the four?
Yes, I did, because
Eric
Eric
had
had
mentioned
mentioned
it.
that, and I was hoping you might clarify.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And so I'm going to jump back actually, because I looked in, Lama Tsongkhapa addresses that in his commentary to Nagarjuna's fundamental treatise on the middle way. He wrote a text called, Lama Tsongkhapa wrote a commentary that called Ocean of Reasoning, where he addresses it, but he also addresses it in this text. So I was looking at both. I was like looking at what he says there, but also then I looked back at what he says here.
What page was
And so I'm jumping back first to page. It's let's see, page 270 and 271. If you have the text and want to look. Right. So I actually have to pull up. I actually saved a website that has there it is. So sometimes there are different ways. I mean, there are different verses on this and different, right? But sometimes, to put it simply, sometimes it's the four extremes. Or sometimes it's said the four extremes would be existence, non-existence, both existence and non-existence, or neither existence nor non-existence. Right? That would be one way of describing what the four extremes are. And sometimes they say you shouldn't fall into any of those extremes, right? So don't fall into the extreme of existence or the extreme of non-existence, or the extreme of both existence and non-existence, or the extreme of neither existence and non-existence. Actually, I'll just say, like, if you look at that very superficially without thinking deeply, it could seem like it's just saying, like, I don't know what the word is. If you don't think deeply about it, it would seem just like inconceivable, or it would seem like, well, you can almost say, well, then I give up. Or something, I don't know. If things don't exist, and they don't not exist, and they don't, it's like, but Lama Tsongkhapa gives a very, as he's wanted to do, gives a very clear point. And what he makes this point, he says we have to be able to differentiate between, how to say this right. One point, as a preliminary to understanding that, Lama Tsongkhapa says, you have to understand that there's a difference between inherent existence and mere existence. Does that make sense, first of all? So what that means is, well, actually, we've been talking about that all day today, haven't we? Also, on this last 2 hours, right? That there's a difference between things existing, I'm going to call it inherently, or truly, or from their own side, or intrinsically, or they're merely being existent, right? That would be conventional, right? Mere conventionality is different than ultimately existing, right? And we also have to understand there's a difference between non-existence by way of its own character and complete non-existence. Does that make sense? So like if I say, if I do a logical, if I do an ultimate analysis, because the object of negation, right? If I were to say, is there a, if the question is an ultimate question, right? Like, is there an inherently, ultimately existent virahi? And then I do a ultimate analysis and discover there's not, right? So that's non-existence by way of its own character, right? And that logical reasoning disproved the existence of an inherently, intrinsically existent virahi, right? But that wasn't a question. It was never raising the question: is there a conventionally merely appearing virahi, right? That's not a question for ultimate analysis. That's a conventional question. We've been getting at this differentiation. Does that make sense? So one has to differentiate those in order to understand Madhyamaka texts, is what he's saying. Right, and we got, and also his whole section in earlier about what's the word, illusion-like. It was addressing that also, right? That illusion-like appearances don't exist as they appear, but the illusion appears, right? The illusion does appear, right? So he's gotten that in various ways. So then, on page 271 here, he says, same thing he kind of says in the other text about this topic of the four extremes. He actually addresses the four extremes briefly. He says, that thing is not existent, it exists, it does not exist, it is not non-existent. He's getting at those terms here. But to clarify, what's he saying? He's saying the meaning of this phrase, right, is this, is if you fall into the extreme of existence, what's that? Right? He's saying, so he's saying that, why is that an extreme? Whereas, because existence in that context, what's the word you say, right, means existence by way of its own character or inherent existence, right? And he's saying, if you believe in existence in the sense of inherent existence, that's an extreme, it's wrong. Does that make sense? Things don't exist in that way. On the other hand, if you believe in non-existence, right, that things don't exist at all, then you've become nihilistic, right? Then you've mistaken lack of existence for its own, by its way of its own character for complete non-existence, which is incorrect, right? So on the one hand, there's the extreme of existence where you're reifying, you're adding something, right? That's what the way he talks about it, projecting something onto things, and that's a mistake, so it's an extreme. On the other hand, non-existence, where you haven't differentiated non-existence by its own character from complete non-existence, then you're deprecating, right? So if I were to say, I disprove that through analysis that virahi exists, ultimately, therefore, she doesn't exist at all. She's not really sitting there, and she's not a person. That's deprecating. That's taking away. Right? It's what's the word? Like it's negating. It's like you're underestimating. I guess you're taking away something that does exist, right? At one point, Lama Tsongkhapa would say is, if you've disproved both of those, then it's easy to disprove both existence and non-existence. In other words, because if they're both, if each of them is incorrect individually, then to say, well, they're both true would be ludicrous, right? And then this is an important one: neither existence nor non-existence. That actually gets back to, remember, like when we were actually doing the meditation on emptiness, we talked about the pervasion, right? The things have to, so we had that pervasion, that things have to be one or many, was the one, like, that all existent things are, in other words, if you understand the meaning of singular or plural or one or many, then a thing that would be truly existent has to either be either one or many. Here, the pervasion would be, if a thing, let's see, say this right, that there is like a, that things either, like that existent and non-existent would be, what's the word? Exhaustive categories, right? Like, so, in other words, like, if I say the horn of a rabbit, that's a non-existent, right? And if I say the ear of a rabbit, that's an existent. But that those are exhaustive categories for phenomena. Does that make sense? Like, so in other words, you could have phenomena that don't exist at all, like, that you could talk about, but they don't exist, like the horn of a rabbit is a traditional Buddhist example. There are countless non-existent things you could make up, I suppose. Right. What's that? Unicorns, all kinds of things, yeah. But that those are exhaustive categories, and so to assert that there's something, it means that you haven't understood the idea of pervasion, right? That, in other words, that it's which means that those are exhaustive categories. That anything you could, actually anything you could make up, actually, is either existent or non-existent. There is no other third alternative. And so, if you think about the four extremes, what it's saying is that if you fall into any of those positions, and the point is that there are philosophers who have fallen into all of those. Actually, that's why they teach this. Actually, and that's why it actually comes from Nagarjuna at that point. And what he was getting at there is there are people who fall into the extreme of existence, and those are, for example, what's the word? Like they call them sometimes substantialists. People who actually somebody who believes like an eternal soul would be somebody who fell into the extreme of existence. Right? Somebody who says, just if you say the I truly exists, that would be that. Right? Somebody who's fallen into the extreme of non-existence would be a nihilist. Right? Like, I personally think like modern American culture is mostly modern American culture is mostly a culture that's fallen to the extreme of non-existence. Whereas we kind of have this nihilistic view that whatever we do doesn't matter, so we can destroy the planet, and so on. But anyway, so non-existence would be that, right? People who are nihilists have fallen into the extreme of non-existence. And then there are people who, I can't remember. There are certain Indian philosophical schools that had this view that things both exist and non-exist, and that neither existence nor non-existence. There are some schools actually that have this view that like things exist in an inexpressible way, that's beyond reasoning. And Prasangikas would say, no. They don't exist that way, and that you're saying they exist that way is an assertion of something that doesn't exist. So you're making up, they would say actually that's a kind of reification, that you're projecting onto things some status that's beyond. If you say, oh, things truly exist in a way that's beyond words, actually you're just using words to make up a way that things exist, that they don't actually exist. So anyway, in brief, that would be a summary of what Lama Tsongkhapa would say about the four extremes. Does that make sense? And so the idea is that, and I'll conclude with this, and we should stop, is that, so in a way, what Lama Tsongkhapa was saying is if you understand, this whole section really, which is why I thought it was a great question to address, is that if you understand accurately the meaning of of conventional truth and ultimate truth, it protects you from any of the extremes, right? Because you understand, if you understand the ultimate, actually it's quite fascinating. If you understand the ultimate truth, right? Actually, if you understand either one correctly, you can't fall into the extremes, can you? Right? Because if you understand the meaning of ultimate truth accurately, it's not negating all existence, right? It's negating inherent existence. And so that means, first of all, it means obviously things aren't completely non-existent. There's not just nothing. Right? Emptiness doesn't mean that. And also you're certifying that emptiness exists, which is non-existent, right? On the other hand, when you understand conventional truth, right? If you understand that conventional truth is truth that appears in a deceptive way, right? On the one hand, you understand, but it's existent as an object of knowledge, right? Whereas even if the way you're perceiving something, you're perceiving it as inherently existent, but it's not inherently existent, implies it exists. It exists in a way that's not inherently existent, right? So you're negating that things don't exist at all, but you're also negating that they exist inherently. So by understanding the two truths, you actually negate the four extremes. That's my point. If you understand conventional truth and ultimate truth, then that protects you from falling into the four extremes, is the idea.
And isn't that the definition of Madhyamaka, or the middle way?
Yeah, exactly. So it's a middle way between the extremes of exist. And sometimes they just summarize it. Sometimes that's where they often will summarize it as the extremes of existence and non-existence. Sometimes they elaborate into four, but sometimes they just summarize it because they're like, well, if you don't fall into the extreme of existence and non-existence, then you'll know that the other two are not valid either. But yes, that's right. So the middle way is between those extremes of, and again, what Lama Tsongkhapa is just emphasizing though is that we have to, that if we don't, I think it's quite an important point because I said this before. Sometimes I was talking, like one of my closest friends. sometimes he would get into this thing where he would call me up and we'd have these discussions, and he would say, he was meditating on emptiness, and he would say, you know, well, they say things don't exist, but like, you know, the pain I'm having, and he was sick at the time, he said, my pain definitely exists, like, and that's ridiculous, like, I'm in pain all morning, don't tell me it doesn't exist, that's, you know, and the point was like, yeah, they were forgetting to say, they were like, nobody had pointed out what's the word, that there's a qualifier. Things don't exist ultimately, right? Conventionally, the pain exists. Does it exist as it appears? No. But it exists conventionally, right? And it's affecting, and it brings about effects, right? Like, you can't sleep, and can't eat, and can't,
And it has
you know.
causes and conditions.
And it has all kinds of causes and conditions, and if they change, it'll stop, and if they increase, it'll increase, and so, again, like, if we don't qualify exist, you know, or if the same thing, like, yeah, if they say, you know, so you get the point. So there's just to say it doesn't exist. I mean, you can say that, but you have to know in the back of your mind what that means is from its own side, or inherently, or independently, right? So we have to know what the meaning is, or else it just gets confusing, actually. All right, we should do our dedication. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chinrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara